One night fighter controller in the Kammhuber Line, 11 minutes, 3 Würzburg scopes, and a sky full of false echoes or 700 bombers reach Hamburg. He throws every searchlight wide and commits his fighters into the noise. The stream goes through almost untouched, and a city ignites. By the end, the man who built a war around willpower is forced to accept something colder. Air power crushes will when it strangles fuel, pilots, and time. Hours earlier, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia buzzed with reports from Hamburg. Operation Gomorrah had opened on 24th to 25th July 1943, and by the night of 27th to 28th July, an RAF raid created a firestorm that erased entire districts and killed on the order of tens of thousands. When the updates landed, a shaken leader summoned his air chief and the night defense architect to explain how British bombers had walked through 4 nights of defenses. Hermann Göring arrived with wounded pride and no solution. General Josef Kammhuber had an answer, but it cut deep. The RAF had thrown window, thin strips of aluminum, in the path of German radar. The carefully built night fighter grid, the Himmelbett boxes, had been blinded almost at once. Albert Speer's teams moved across the ruins and then did the math no one wanted to read. Hamburg's industrial base had been torn open, skilled workers were dead or scattered, armaments output in the city cratered. His warning followed. Repeat this scale of attack on several major cities, and the war economy would fold. What made it fold was not one raid, but a system coming apart. The Kammhuber Line was a chain of night defense cells, each with a Freya early warning set watching the sky, and a Würzburg radar guiding a single night fighter to a single bomber. It worked like a conveyor belt of kills, provided the conveyor moved at the defender's pace. Bomber Command refused that pace. Crews in Avro Lancasters and Halifaxes learned to fly as one mass, the bomber stream, punching through a narrow time gate to overload each Himmelbett cell. Pathfinders from No. 8 Group arrived first, dropping target indicators to pin the aiming point even under cloud, and the main force poured over the beacons on the second. Then came window. Chaff blooms through curtains of false targets into Freya and Würzburg scopes. Controllers saw swarms of phantoms, searchlight belts slashed empty air, night fighters chased decoys while the real stream slid past on stopwatch timing. Why this works was cruelly simple. 1 defender, 1 fighter, 1 radar, and 100 ghost returns. Procedure changed on the German side, but slowly and at cost. Day fighters were pushed into night duties as Wild Sau, stalking the glare of burning cities, while larger formations tried Zame Sau, massing above beacons and then diving into the bomber stream by eye. Kills came, but the price was pilot attrition and chaos in the same light that guided the bombers. Across the day sky, a second blade turned. The USAAF 8th Air Force hit strategic targets in daylight with B-17S and B-24s in tight boxes, trusting formation firepower and a growing fighter escort. In 1943, escorts fell short of the deepest targets. Losses mounted over places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg when German fighters massed for head-on attacks. That calculus flipped in early 1944. Lieutenant General James H. Doolittle took command in January and uncaged the escorts. P-47 Thunderbolts and, crucially, long-legged P-51 Mustangs no longer hugged the bombers. They swept ahead and hunted the Luftwaffe wherever it formed, strafing airfields on the way home. Combat shifted from protecting bombers to killing the enemy air force. Operation Argument, Big Week, 20 to 25 February 1944, made the intent explicit. U.S. and RAF raids pounded aircraft factories, drew the Luftwaffe up, and then cut into its spine. The math of attrition turned one-sided when escorts reached the fight in numbers, from assembly to dispersal. Fuel then became the lever that moved everything. On May 12, 1944, the sustained oil campaign opened with major blows on synthetic plants such as the Leuna/Merseburg complex. Refineries and hydrogenation units were rebuilt and hit again. By late summer, aviation fuel output had collapsed to a fraction of earlier levels. Training hours fell with it. New Luftwaffe pilots who once logged far more time arrived with roughly 110 to 120 hours in the book, many of them in trainers and gliders, and they went up against veteran escorts. Jets like the Me-262 promised speed, but they needed fuel, spare engines, and airfields not under constant watch. Anti-aircraft guns multiplied around cities as fear answered steel with steel. The 8.8-centimeter flak drew in crews and ammunition on a massive scale. By 1944, flak absorbed on the order of 1 million personnel. Every gun moved to a city was one the Army no longer had at the front. Industrial dispersal looked like resilience, but bled efficiency. Machine tools were evacuated, assembly lines were split across towns. Transport hubs became vital arteries and obvious targets. When escorts swept the rail lines and marshalling yards in daylight, movement turned into a timetable of losses. The lesson Speer wrote after Hamburg hardened into policy. Destroy enough capacity fast enough, and recovery could not keep pace. The oil strikes made every other shortage sharper. Tanks and trucks that existed could not move, pilots could not train, jets could not climb in meaningful numbers, and infantry divisions received fewer guns because flak had already claimed them. We are now on the hinge. If you want to watch this break unfold raid by raid and decision by decision, subscribe so you don't miss how the skies closed over Germany. Night again over Germany. The stream forms up over the North Sea, bomber after bomber sliding into a lane measured in miles and minutes, throttles pegged to a time on target they must hit. Controllers see the first returns and reach for procedures built over years. Freya plots a curve. Würzburg takes a handoff. The vector goes out to a night fighter crew climbing blind into ordered chaos. Window starts to fall. Strips of foil tumble and bloom, and the scopes crawl with 1,000 false tracks. Searchlights find the wrong sky. Flak crews fire at noise. The bomber stream holds course and slips between the beams. Pathfinders mark the target. Red and green indicators fall through smoke, marking the eastern districts, and main force bombers line up on the colors and the clock. Heat swells, wind feeds it, fires join and roar in a ring. Inside shelters, air thins. Streets are torn open and fed to the flame. Tram wires whip. Doors are ripped from hinges by a pull that feels like a hand on the chest. When the last bombers clear, the city behind them is an embered void. Morning at Wolf's Lair comes with ash in the reports. The air chief has bluster but not theory. The night defense general has theory but no fix. The leader has rage and a fear that numbers can now confirm. On the long table, Spears slides bridge ruins to production lines. He lays out machine shops missing crews, power stations failed, railheads choked, and output curves that fall off a cliff for the city. If this repeats in several major cities, he says, national war production cannot maintain the front. Across the Baltic, weeks later, Peenemünde is quiet from the ground and alive from the air. Operation Hydra forms up, pathfinders breaking out low cloud and dropping markers over research halls and living quarters. Crews press their runs through flak and confusion. The next day, the program begins to scatter underground, and the clock on secret weapons turns slower. Autumn brings fewer protections and more bombs. RAF Bomber Command uses H2S ground mapping, and the Pathfinder force to push into weather and darkness. USAAF crews hit in daylight, on a rhythm that strains German repair crews to exhaustion. Factories stand up replacements. Escorts and return raids knock them down again. Winter thins the oil that's left. Training sorties are cut to save for operations. Instructors ration throttle. New pilots are rushed into combat with too little instrument time. Out on the edge of every engagement, that deficit writes itself in smoke. January 1944 flips the switch on the day war. Doolittle orders the escorts to hunt, and P-51s cross the Zuiderzee with drop tanks full and radios crackling for free sweeps. German controllers build an intercept. Before formations can harden, Mustangs are above them and diving through. Over Regensburg and Brunswick, Big Week keeps the pressure on. Fighter plants take hits, assembly jigs burn, but the deeper damage lands in the climb-out and recovery windows, where escorts gate-crash the Luftwaffe and hammer it again above its own airfields. First week of March, Berlin learns that daylight can now reach it. On March 6, 1944, hundreds of B-17s push to the capital with Mustangs riding shotgun. Flak is heavy, fighters rise in blocks, and the escorts turn into them in wave after wave. The message is not theory now. German airspace is penetrated front to back. Below, the flak towers fire inexhaustibly and still cannot stop it. The gunners do their jobs, hundreds of thousands of them across the Reich, as industry pulls more boys and gray-haired men into crews. Each shell costs steel and explosive the army could use, and the barrels cannot hold back attrition in the sky. May opens the oil map. Luna/Merseburg takes a hammer blow. Distillation columns and hydrogenation plants go black. Repair crews roll in, and the raid schedule meets them there again days later. Smokestacks leak, pipelines falter, drumstock empties, and by summer, aviation fuel is starving the force. In fighter schools, the syllabus shrinks. Spins and instrument holds give way to quick circuits and a first gunnery pass before assignment. Young men step from trainers into frontline cockpits and face Mustangs on their second or third combat sortie. Jet units form with ceremony and fight with anxiety. Me-262s roar down concrete lanes and leap clean of piston fighters, then circle with throttles low to save kerosene. A handful of kills fall to speed. Maintenance and fuel bottlenecks stall the promise on the ground. On the rails, daylight grows dangerous. P-47As and P-51As roam the marshalling yards and junctions, cutting locomotives and fuel cars, leaving wreckage that takes days to clear. Supply meant for the front dies 5 miles from the siding. Armored units learn to live by the sun. Columns move by night, hide by day, and still lose trucks to fighter bombers hunting the glint of metal down roads. Tanks sit, engines cold, waiting for fuel that does not come. Allies keep the pressure synchronized. RAF night raids grind down urban centers and morale. USAAF daylight strikes strip the Luftwaffe of pilots and planes and then push into oil and transport. Repairs happen, but the pace of damage outruns men and materials. Inside the Wolf's Lair, and later in Berlin bunkers, the briefings darken. Losses of fighters exceed new machines. Pilot classes are smaller. Fuel allocations are cut again. The promise of new weapons arrives late and thin, and without fuel and air cover, the promise means less each week. By late 1944, the imbalance is permanent. Luftwaffe training hours are down, operational sorties are rationed, and ground units learn to fear any clear sky. The decision to pull more anti-aircraft guns to city belts takes shape as necessity and hollowing out at the same time. Rail maps on walls sprout red lines of interdiction. Bridges drop, repair trains work under camouflage nets. Replacement rails arrive slowly over roads hammered from above. What gets through comes by miracle, or because escorts are busy hunting elsewhere that day. Through winter into 1945, the front still exists. Trenches, guns, divisions on paper, and yet it moves at the mercy of Allied air plans. When the weather lifts, columns shrink into timber lines and wait for cloud, and couriers ride bicycles to hide in hedges when engines whine. Down in engine sheds, ground crews drain sumps for the last liters of aviation fuel. Taxi tests replace sorties. Pilots practice in their heads while they wipe dust from windscreens. The shape of defeat is now routine, a calendar written in fuel deliveries and missing them. Even in the final weeks, orders demand attacks that aircraft cannot fly. Jets are promised to sectors but arrive in ones and twos. Me-Too 6-2s that take off are counted by staff officers waiting at the runway's end. Above them, escorts wait for any movement and end it. In those rooms where power once felt absolute, the air war's numbers hold the floor. Hamburg showed a city could be annihilated in a night. Big Week and Berlin in daylight proved the Luftwaffe could not defend the heartland. The oil campaign made defeat irreversible by drying the arteries of war. Immediate orders followed the shock. Göring promised countermeasures and redeployments, Kammhuber argued for new tactics and equipment filters, and Speer's offices formalized the warning in memoranda delivered by mid-August. Records vary on the exact words exchanged in those briefings, but the decisions to adapt were written up within days. The strategic payoff was brutal clarity. With escorts dominant by early 1944 and oil output collapsing after May, the Luftwaffe lost the initiative and the Army lost mobility, making eventual defeat a question of time and blood. Practice changed under pressure. German night defenses experimented with wild sow and Sammesow. Industry dispersed to hide from pathfinders. Flak belts thickened over cities, and pilot training hours were cut as fuel ran out. None reversed the curve. Air power's edge came from method, not magic. Overwhelm sensors, stretch defenders, and then cut the fuel that feeds recovery. Once the oil and pilots were gone, the rest of the war machine slowed to a halt, no matter the slogans. For more hard-edged breakdowns of the moments when the war pivoted, subscribe.